I'm not a great person with technology, so hopefully all of this will work smoothly. So excited to have this opportunity to share with you about C.S. Lewis. One of the things that I wanted to emphasize last week when I was speaking, the value of looking at the lives of Christian evangelists, ministers, missionaries, church fathers like Augustine. There's a real popular trend of that. I was thinking this morning about the Unbroken movie that was about, Christian testimony. I want to suggest some others along the way. So although this is not my speaking from the scriptures, which I can do, but I want to be able to just inspire you in the ways that Lewis has inspired me and helped to form my life. So I just want to kind of preface that. I'm not excluding the importance of the scriptures, and next week we're going to talk about Lewis's view on the scriptures. So we're going to get to those things, but today I'm going to focus mostly on just his life, events in his life, so that you will become more familiar with him as a person. And then as we talk about the things that he wrote and the things that his theology and his ideas, we'll be able to connect into his life in more personal and significant ways. So very much this is kind of more like a lecture, if you'll bear with me, but I think it'll be important for us to get that as a background. So wanted to see, it's not arrowing up, Daniel.
Oh, you're having to use my computer, sorry about that.
Yeah.
You might have to use this one here.
Oh, okay, good. Different button. So for the next 8 weeks, in January 9th through February 27th, I'll be teaching weekly on Lewis topics. These classes will examine C.S. Lewis's thoughts on various subjects such as Scripture, and that's what we'll handle. This is kind of the order that they will be in. Scripture, on prayer, on church, on trials and suffering, on disciplines for spiritual growth, and on evangelism. And I'm very excited about approaching Lewis this way, because usually I start just working with his specific books and writings, and this is a more topical approach. So I'm very excited to do that. Some people have asked me about books, and you don't need to have any specific books by Lewis, but these are the 2 books that I'm kind of working from. They're both by a C.S. Lewis scholar, Lyle Dorset, who I've had the opportunity to meet personally, and from time to time I shoot him an email with a question about something. He was originally a professor at Wheaton. He's moved on to, I think he might be retired at this point. But the book on the left, The Essential C.S. Lewis, is actually an anthology, and it's the book that I used in my class when I taught C.S. Lewis. It has complete works like Paralandra, Abolition of Man, and it has selections from the wide range of genre that Lewis wrote in. So, and you can readily get it on Amazon. You can get used copies for less than $4. So it's a very affordable book, and if you just kind of want to broaden your experience with C.S. Lewis, I think it's a great text. I've told Lyle Dorset he owes me royalty from all of the copies that I've had students buy and have recommended to people. The second book is Seeking the Secret Place, and as I was doing research and getting ready for teaching this, I came across this book. It was published in 2017, but I wasn't aware of it. There's so many books that come out on C.S. Lewis, it's hard to keep up on it. But it is this approach to the spiritual formation of C.S. Lewis. So I'll be using material from that, and if you wanted to purchase that, that might be a second book you'd be interested in. So those are there. I wanted to talk about Lewis's birth and early life because anybody's biographical outline of their lives is important to know something about their early formation. And you know that about yourself and about others that you are, that you know. Dan and I just did our DNA and sent it off to Ancestry, and we're really excited about learning a little bit more about our own backgrounds. So it's a very popular idea, but it lays the foundation, the formation of who and what a person becomes. And so I want to take just a little time to talk about that. Now, this chronology I borrowed from Lyle Dorset's anthology, and I would use it religiously while I was teaching to keep my dates straight in my mind. And I do have a correction from Sunday last week. I said that Lewis taught at Cambridge for 3 years, and it was actually 9 years. It was longer than I thought. I was doing the math in my head while I was talking, and I got it wrong. But he was born in Belfast, Ireland, on November 29, 1898. And a lot of people don't realize that he was Irish and not English. And later, when World War I broke out, because he had been educated in England, he felt an obligation to fight for England. He didn't have to because of being Irish. But his roots in Ireland were very, very important to him. He didn't like to travel, but the one thing that he did once a year is that he went back to Ireland and spent time with family, very large families on both sides, lots of cousins. And his very best friend, Arthur Greaves, who he wrote letters to on a weekly basis throughout his life. And that's a very important body of material and available if you want to look closer at that. He moved to the outskirts of Belfast when he was 9 years old to Little Lee. I'll get my math right here, I guess 7 years old. Little Lee plays a really prominent place in his life. And you can go online and see pictures of Little Lee. He talks about both his parents were avid readers, and he talks about stacks of books everywhere on the stairs and in the bookcases and in the attic. And he was encouraged to and allowed to read anything that he wanted. There were no books, no topics that were forbidden. His father was a lawyer, solicitor, and his mother went to university and got honors in mathematics. And she taught mathematics to her sons in their educational process at home. She was a brilliant woman and very well read, and played a very important and influential role for a brief time in Lewis's life. When he was 9 in 1908, his mother dies of abdominal cancer. And this is when you were treated in the home. The surgery was done in the home. A tumor was removed. And Lewis, the smells, the sounds, it was a very profound impact on his life. And he describes in his biography, Surprised by Joy, that it was kind of the end of the life that he had known up to that point. His father was grieving so much over the loss of his wife that he didn't have much left to give to Lewis and his older brother, Warnie. And so within just a few months, he sends Lewis, at the age of 9, off to England to a private school. So he lost not only his mother, but he also lost his father. And it was a tremendous time of grief in his life. And he writes about it and talks about it, and it comes back into our story a little bit later. In 1914, he moves to Surrey and is tutored by W.T. Kirkpatrick, known as the Great Knock. Now, in the English educational process, boys from middle class, upper middle class homes would go to private schools. And Lewis had been in a series of private schools, none of which he was really crazy about. And there's stories about that time in his life. But he was, in England, you go to school through a grammar school and not quite a full high school. And at the end of that time, you take examinations, and examinations will determine whether you can go on to university or if you go on to a vocational school. So they're very, very important exams. And you don't get an A, B, C, D, you get a pass or fail. So it's a very significant time. Kirkpatrick was an older gentleman. He had been actually Lewis's father's tutor. And he had tutored Warney, Lewis's brother. And Lewis was not happy with the preparatory school that he'd been sent to in Ireland, and so he was sent to be with William Kirkpatrick. And again, if you look at Surprised by Joy, that chapter about the Great Knock is just really fascinating. But the thing that he took away from this experience, and very important to us as we look at Lewis as a Christian apologetic voice in the 20th century, was that Kirkpatrick taught him how to think. Kirkpatrick was a very intelligent man, and that kind of intelligent approach to thinking, and very rational, bringing traditional logic into how Lewis began to think. And he used the Platonic process of question-answer. So Lewis quickly learned that you don't just say something unless you really know what you're saying. And because the Great Knock would knock you down and would question you over and over until you get to the root, and then he'd make his point of what he was trying to teach him. It was also a wonderful environment for Lewis, and he talks about what he considers, the best day, the typical day that he would like to live as a scholar, which includes tea exactly at 4 o'clock. And he had opportunities to walk in the Surrey landscape, and it really formed him as a young man. In 1916, while he's in Surrey, he's taking a train ride, and he buys a book at the train station, like we do today perhaps at the airport. And it's by George MacDonald, and it's called Fantastes. And this is an extraordinary moment in his life, and he writes about it in Surprised by Joy. And the same day, he sends a letter off to Arthur Greaves, his best friend in Ireland, about this experience. And he describes it as the baptism of his imagination, which is a profound event. Now, Lewis kind of had two sides, like we do, a left brain, right brain. One side of his mind was very logical, very rational, full of reason, very intellectual. But on the other side was this imagination that began as a young boy. And he describes that process. It's what he calls joy. This longing for something that you can't quite grab onto. And if you have a momentary experience where you feel this joy, it can never be replicated. And he calls his autobiography Surprised by Joy, because it's when he comes to Christ that he realizes the joy that he's been seeking all his life is fulfilled. So it's very significant in that. So this gets him into thinking in more imaginative ways and nurturing that side of his brain. So Lewis writes theology, but he writes fiction. He writes children's literature. He writes the Screwtape Letters. He writes a space trilogy. So he had a very active imagination, and that finds expression in the things that he wrote. In 1917, he goes into University College. It's right at the beginning of World War I. In April, He's commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 2nd Somerset Light Infantry. He's made a lieutenant because he's at Oxford University. And in September, he goes to the front. And in November, and the expectation of a young man in the infantry going to the French front was 2 weeks. If you get a chance to, explore some of what World War I was about, it was a very horrific war. And J.R.R. Tolkien, who also was a soldier in World War I, when he talks about Mordor, and he talks about the hobbits going through, what is it, where the dead faces, the swamps, that was drawn from his experience as a soldier, seeing the dead bodies in the puddles of mud and water. So that World War I is a very significant influence and shapes the lives of both Tolkien and Lewis, and of course of others. And then in April, he's wounded in action. And a bomb goes off, it's friendly fire, he gets shrapnel in his body, and he still had shrapnel in his body until his death. And he lays in hospital for months and months and months in the process of recovering. So again, we'll touch on that when we talk about his understanding of suffering. And when he writes about pain, the problem of pain, he had experienced that on a very much a first-hand basis. In 1919 to 1923, he comes back to school at the end of the war, and he completes his BA and master's. And in 1924, he assumes duties as a tutor at University College. He wanted to be an educator, and so this was a natural process. He got top honors. Again, you don't get a grade, it's a pass or fail, but top honors in the study of English literature and also philosophy. So he understood philosophy, and that comes into his writings a great deal. He would not call himself a theologian because he did not have a degree in theology. But we're going to see that he very much understood theology, but he did it from a layman's perspective. And he would repeatedly remind us that he was just a layman talking about what he knew through his personal experiences. And that just brings that theology down to a level that the common person, everyone, can relate to. He was elected a fellow in English language and literature at Magdalen College in Oxford. And this was a significant event for him. He was going to spend the next 30 years of his life teaching at Magdalen. But what is, I think, interesting to us is that he was never promoted. He came in, for me, when I was a university professor, you start as an instructor. And then you go through levels of promotion based on years of experience and publish or perish, all of those kind of things. And he never rose above being just a tutor, which was a heavy, heavy workload for a teacher. Now, he did do lectures, and his lectures were very popular, and they would put him in the biggest room at Oxford University. They were very well attended by individuals. He was active in the Socratic Club. He did a lot of things. But he wasn't promoted primarily because he was a Christian and an outspoken Christian. And they did not feel that it was appropriate for a Oxford Don to be writing about Christianity, screw tape letters, or children's literature. And so he was slighted, and he was passed over multiple times, and it was a difficult thing for him to endure, but he did. And again, that'll come into our discussion about his ability to understand what it is to suffer. Some of you may have had those kind of experiences at work. And I know that there were times in my own academic career or I connected with Lewis about that, because it's just a part of being in any kind of large corporation or job. He would be offered in 1955 a position at Cambridge University. And they not only offered him a job, but they made him a full professor, top of the rating, and they endowed a chair for him, which still stands today at Cambridge University. So for the first time, after 30 years, he's honored in a very special and wonderful way. So then Magdalen College said, whoa, we don't want to lose you. And he really thought about it, talked with friends, spent several weeks trying to decide whether or not to take this new position at Cambridge, and then did. And standing on the outside looking at Lewis's story is such a blessing to me that finally he was recognized for the great man of letters and intellectual achievements, and honored in that way. Lewis didn't drive, which is kind of surprising. He never learned how to drive an automobile. In many ways, because he was born in 1898, he was very Victorian, kind of old-fashioned. He describes himself in his speech for accepting his chair at Cambridge as a dinosaur. But he said, we still need some dinosaurs around to remind us. So he didn't drive, and so he would take the bus, or there was a nice long walk from where he lived in Headington Quarry to Oxford. But he had to have a driver to take him to Cambridge. And so a driver came and picked him up and took him, and he stayed on campus during the week as Oxford dons and Cambridge dons do, and then the driver would bring him back. I always think that's really interesting that he didn't like to drive. He said that the world was a better place because he never learned how to drive. He taught medieval and Renaissance literature. He served there until August 23rd, and when he resigned his chair due to his illness and subsequent death in November, he found out that he had terminal disease, and he decided that he needed to retire at that point, but he was there for 9 years. So Lewis's faith and writings. And again, I'm using a chronological way of approaching these topics. In 1929, he became a theist, and talked a little bit about that on Sunday. If you've seen the new movie that's out of the most reluctant convert, how many of you have seen that? It's online if you want to rent it and see it, and it'll probably come out on DVD soon. But his process of becoming a Christian was very drawn out, about 3.5 years. And he was a very confirmed atheist. Shortly after the death of his mother, he prayed to God that God would heal his mother, and then even prayed to God that God would raise her from the dead. And God didn't answer his prayers. And then over his educational process, including the Great Knock, there were atheists that continued to shape and form that atheistic way of looking at faith. In 1931, he confesses his belief in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, so he becomes a Christian. And that in part came through conversations with J.R. Tolkien, who was a profound Christian Catholic in his faith, and long talks into the night, convincing Lewis that Jesus Christ was real. Lewis embraced the idea of myth. It's very much a part of his writing, but to him, Christianity was just another myth that was being told. And one evening, J.R. Tolkien and another friend, Dyson, was able to convince him that Jesus is the true myth, that all of the other myths are based on, and that's very much a core part of his literature. And as I shared on Sunday, the way that he kind of announced to the world that he now was a believer is he went to church, he walked down the aisle, he took communion, which in the Anglican Church is very significant, and a very public act. And he went to his local parish church. I've been there on a number of occasions. One summer when I was at Oxford, I was able to go almost every Sunday to his parish church. It's a small building, typical stone church, big wooden doors that you walk through, very aesthetically pleasing. And Lewis is buried in that churchyard, which I think is significant. And he's buried, his brother is buried with him, and in the same grave. And it says something about the relationship that he had with his brother Warnie. And I would love to talk to you more about Warnie. I think he's a very neglected character in our story, but also a very extraordinary individual. And they were confirmed bachelors, and they lived most of their adult life together until Lewis married late in life. We'll talk about that more in a moment. And then they continued to live together. So a very significant figure in Lewis's life. In 1940, and in this chronology that I'm using from Lyle Dorset's book, he lists all the times that Lewis's books were published, what they were and when they were published. And I'm kind of skipping over that, but I'll highlight a few. He published The Problem of Pain. That was his first kind of theological book that he wrote. And he began lectures on Christianity to members of the Royal Air Force. In the startup for World War II, there were several training camps outside of Oxford, and Lewis on a weekly basis would go out and speak to the soldiers. And of course that was significant because he had fought in World War I. He understood what it felt like to be prepared to be launched onto a battlefield. And I think it really played an important role in shaping his ideas about evangelism, about how to share his faith with individuals. In 1941, he began a series of over 20 talks on the British Broadcasting Corporation, or BBC, radio, some of which will become part of Mere Christianity. The BBC was trying to produce programs that were encouraging and uplifting to the English people, and Lewis had gained fame as being a Christian apologetic voice, and so they asked him to do these series of talks. They were 15 minutes long, was all the time that he had. They had to be tightly scripted because the Germans in Japanese that they were at war with could kind of grab them and insert propaganda in the radio programs. It was a real unique experience for Lewis. It was the first time he ever heard his voice on the BBC. And they were so well received that the BBC began to keep asking him to come back. But one of the things that came out of those BBC talks was Mere Christianity. He published shorter books that then were combined together, and then he edited them again. And in the Mere Christianity, you find these analogies that he uses, and he went back through them and really tried to shape the books so that it was even more effective than the BBC talks or the earlier publications. And again, if you've not read Mere Christianity, it's a great introduction to C.S. Lewis, and a great one for understanding ways that you can share your faith in very powerful ways. And as I shared on Sunday, I've spent time doing kind of one-on-one Bible studies with new converts or with people that were open, to Christianity. And it's a great book for discipleship because it's not just the leading one into Christianity, but the later parts of the book, it talks about practical things like tithing and what Lewis called charity, and theological pieces about the Trinity. And so it's a really good book to take a closer look at. And I'm going to be a book pusher here all the way through this, so you just have to put up with it. He published in 1942 the Screwtape Letters, which was very significant, and I went online this morning to get my facts right. I've been doing a lot of fact checking this past week. But in 1947, Time magazine had a cover picture of C.S. Lewis. Now that's pretty significant. And you can see it online, and I'll probably bring it as an image next week. And there's the devil is on one side, and then over on the left side, you see just a wing of an angel. And of course, Screwtape Letters is the world as seen from a devil's perspective. And at the bottom it says, his heresy, Christianity. So he was beginning to be recognized as a very significant voice, apologetic voice in the 20th century. And the Screwtape Letters was very, very popular in America. And that began to give him that wider audience of not just the English, but also American audience. And a number of different denominations, Catholics, evangelicals, and others begin to latch on to C.S. Lewis as an important voice in their own denominations. In 1950 to 1955, he publishes the 7 books of the Chronicles of Narnia. So 7 books in 5 years. Pretty significant. And many people said, well, you kind of like, what right do you have to write about children's books when you're a confirmed bachelor and you don't have any children? And Lewis's defense was that, I never forgot what it was to be childlike. And that's a very dominant theme in his writings. He was greatly influenced by George MacDonald, who wrote fairy tales and children's stories. It's interesting because J.R. Tolkien was laboring away with The Lord of the Rings over a 30-year period to write it. And Tolkien was a little miffed. Because Lewis had written these 7 books in the 5 years, and they were so popular. People couldn't wait for the next book to come out. Again, Tolkien was a little bit miffed about it. In 1952, he meets Joy Davidman, and I'm going to give you just the chronological things, and then I'll talk about it more. They began corresponding actually 2 years before that, and I mentioned that Lewis wrote over 3,000 letters. It's hard to nail it down to a specific number, but more than 3,000 letters in correspondence with various people. And Joy was, she was a communist, she was Jewish, she was divorced, and not a believer. But as she began to come to Christ, she had lots of questions. And she had an intellect. Her son, David, said that no one could match Lewis's intellect but his mother. And one of my favorite, just to give you an idea, they used to play Scrabble together. And they would do it in 4 different languages. So, that's how sharp the two of them were, and they really went together well. He married her in a civil ceremony, and it was for the legal purpose so that she could stay in England. So there was no love match in that. He just did it to allow her to have that ability for her and her sons to stay in England. But on Joy's part, she was in love with Lewis. And he was pretty dense about that kind of stuff. He just, he didn't get it. But in 1957, he finally marries her in an Anglican ceremony in January because she was dying of cancer. And he realized that he loved her. And he wanted to marry her. And because she was divorced, and in the Anglican tradition, he couldn't marry her in the church. but because she was dying in a hospital bed, an Anglican priest that was a friend of Lewis solemnized the marriage. And then a miracle takes place, and the cancer goes into recession, and she is able to come home to the Kilns. And the Kilns, two bachelors living there for all of those years, was a pretty awful place. Lewis and his brother put out their ashes of their cigarettes and pipes on the carpet. They still had the blackout curtains from the World War II. I've been to the Kilns on a number of occasions, and they were doing a restoration, and one of the things that caught my attention was that there was just thick tobacco smoke and coal smoke on the walls. And they stripped all the old stuff off, but they wanted to recreate, because it was a restoration. So they were trying to come up with a concoction that looked like tobacco stain to put on the wall with the paint. So she comes in and she gets new carpets, new curtains, new furniture, just really turns it into a home. And they live very happily together for 5.5 years. And then the cancer comes back, and she dies in 1960. In 1961, he publishes A Grief Observed, and there's two autobiographical pieces by Lewis. One is Surprised by Joy, the second is A Grief Observed, and it's a journal that he kept in the days and weeks after Joy died, and his grief was tremendous, the loss. And he writes about it, and if you're familiar from the psychology point of view, the different stages of grief, you can kind of mark that out as you go through it. And if you've ever been angry at God, and we all have those times when we want to shake our fist at God and we say it's not fair, and we ask the great question, why? Well, Lewis does it in a very honest and poignant way, and in a way that I think at different times in our lives we can all relate to it. And so I strongly encourage that you would read that if that connects with you in areas of your life. He published it under a pen name. He never really intended, for it to get out there into the public. But people kept giving it to friends, who were going through grief. And finally, he published it under his own name. So it's a significant work. And then on November 22nd, 1963, he dies. He had suffered from osteoporosis for a number of years. He had had a heart attack and was in the hospital with a coma. And was expected to die, but he rallied and came back and went back to the Kilns, continued to teach at Cambridge. But ultimately, he died of kidney failure. And when you read about those last weeks of his life, the thing he chose to do was to reread all of his his favorite books. So he sat in his chair and drank tea and read all of those favorite works. It tells you something about him as a reader. Lewis says that you're not a true reader unless you read books multiple times. Some of us have a hard time reading it the first time. But that, and you may have favorite movies that you watch over and over and over again. I do that all the time. If it's on TV and I'm doing housekeeping or whatever, I know it's so familiar. I'm so familiar with it. I don't have to sit down and watch the whole movie. But he said that about books, and he wrote a wonderful little short essay called about readers, and kind of turns it around from focused on the reader, but more on the kind of reader that they are. And it really challenged me. I'm an English literature professor, but it really challenged me in my own reading. And if you're a reader and you like that, that might be something you want to take a closer look at. He dies 1 week short of his 65th birthday. And I thought of Betty White. you know, who died 2 weeks short of her 100th birthday. And he died the same day as Aldous Huxley, who was a atheistic voice in the 20th century, which is kind of an interesting contrast, and on the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So there wasn't really much attention paid to his death because there was these other news events that were going on, and many people were not aware of that until weeks after he had died. Okay, I think I'm at the finish, and we've got about 4 minutes before we have to quit. Is there any questions? Anything that you'd like to know more of? Yes.
What are you saying the name is where he and his brother live? Would you spell it for me?
It's L-E-A, little Lee. And they pronounce it.
the house.
No, she means
Oh,
The kiln.
the kilns.
it's K-I-L-N-S, and it's called that because there was a brick making facility there. And they took the clay and made red bricks out of it, and it was called the kilns. And Lewis purchased the land around it, as well as the home. And it's part of it has a little pond and wooded area that's now belongs to the British government, and kids go there and take little nature walks through it. Most of the area around it is now suburbs. And so many people come to see the house. It is open to the public, but you kind of have to let them know you're coming. And but these buses keep showing up with, 20, 30 people in somebody's cul-de-sac. And it's not favored, but it is, I had the chance to be there on a number of times. Twice when the BBC was there doing a story, and met Douglas Lewis's stepson, and was able to, I worked in the garden one afternoon, and in the flower garden, which was a delight, watering the plants. So it's a thing to go see.
But it's near Oxford.
It's about 10 miles out of Oxford in Headington Quarry, which is just kind of a little suburb. It was more rural at the time that Lewis lived there.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes.
Did Lewis sort of adopt her son after she died?
Yes. He and Morning continued to raise them. Again, with the British tradition, they spent most of their time in their private schools, but they would be there for the summer, or they would be there for holidays. And then when C.S. Lewis died, Warney his brother continued to care for them. And then they kind of went off into the world, they kind of disconnected from the famous C.S. Lewis, but Douglas came back to it when he became a Christian. And you hear his name and voice a great deal.
2 sons.
And there's a second son, David. And I just learned last night that David had suffered from mental illness, from schizophrenia, and that he died in a Swiss mental institution probably about 10 years ago. And I didn't know that. Yes?
Do you regard the book, Becoming Mrs. Lewis, as factual or?
Well, I read it, and I really, it was a Christmas present last year, Becoming Mrs. Lewis, and it's kind of romantic, in the way, so it inserts things that may or may not have been there, but it is a good account of it. I couldn't pick it apart. Any other questions? I've got 1 more minute. Okay, I'll see you in church, and I'll see you next week. We'll talk about scriptures.